Hello again, Dan Alasso, Making History. And today I'm going to do another of my Historian Reacts videos. And this time I'm going to react to Oversimplifying History's Part 1 of the American Revolution. And so the perspective I'm going to look at this is, I teach American history at a northern Minnesota university, and I found this to be pretty accurate and pretty fun, but there were a couple of elements that I thought I wanted to expand on a little bit and clarify a little bit. So, here goes.
Holy smokes! Christopher Columbus, that is no way to address the King and Queen of Spain. What is wrong with you? Okay, so you know how we're looking for a new trade route to India, right? Right. And the Earth is round, right? Right. So I'm thinking we can just sail the other way around the planet, right? Yeah.
Okay, so this Christopher Columbus, the Earth is round issue. I just want to make clear that everybody knew that the Earth was round. Columbus thought that it was a bit smaller than it actually turned out to be. Possibly because he knew that European sailors were already regularly traveling to the Americas to fish for cod in the Grand Banks. And I'll say more about cod in a minute.
So I set sail, right? Mm-hmm. And I reach India, right? Right. Wrong. Wrong. I did not reach India. I did not. All right, get to the point. Did you know there's a whole nother freaking continent out there? Okay, and you think I should care about this? Why? Oh, I'm sorry, did I forget to mention there's gold everywhere? Gold? Columbus landed in...
And so gold is initially important, and gold and silver become increasingly important because as the late 1400s become the early 1500s, the Habsburgs get involved in fighting against the Protestant Reformation. And so they're not only intent on building the Spanish Empire, but also ruling the Holy Roman Empire in Europe. And this and the wars of religion are all super, super expensive.
In Central America in October 1492, and he had the time of his life. And by that I mean he went on a huge theft and murder spree. He stole gold, jewelry, people, and a hammock. And then he returned to show off all of his riches, including a few previously undiscovered items, such as tobacco.
Yeah, he brought back a hammock. Hammock is an Arawak or a Taino word. He also brought back 7 Arawak natives, probably against their will, who he was training to be interpreters. And 5 of them died very quickly of disease, probably before even reaching Spain, suggesting what was in store for the rest of the American natives. He also found
tobacco, the pineapple, turkeys, and a hammock. Now I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified, Columbus didn't discover America, the Vikings did. And you'd be partially right. In the 11th century, Leif Erikson was the first European to land in America. But hey, if you love Vikings...
Hang on a sec. I'm going to skip by the commercial. But before I do that, I want to say that Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, who was the leader of the Greenland colony, did land and did start a colony, but it was in Newfoundland, not in Labrador. And the reason that that's important is, once again, cod.
Now, where was I? Oh yeah, Columbus, time of his life, hammock. And suddenly the race was on to explore and conquer the New World, after a couple centuries of warring with the natives and each other.
Okay, the race was on to explore and conquer, with the help of disease that killed 90 to 95% of all of the American natives. It's a bit amazing that there actually were survivors, there were Native Americans to give the invaders so much trouble, which they do throughout American history. Makes you wonder what might have happened if more of them had survived those initial encounters with all of the diseases that the Europeans brought.
The European powers had claimed quite a lot of land, including this area, which both the English and the French claimed as theirs. One day the French said, I'm going to build some forts along here. And the English were like, could you not? And the French said, sorry, but no, I could not. And they went there.
Okay, so during this couple of centuries, Spain was also beginning to send missions up into California by this time. And then this area that's called Trans-Appalachia, because it's over the Appalachian Mountains, is contested between the French and the English, and it's also contested between the native allies of the French and the English. And the French do set up some forts there, but importantly, they set them up in response to George Washington's father and his father's company, which is a land speculation company, coming out and beginning to do land surveys and to sell this land in preparation to settling it with white people. Now, of course, young George who's famous as a surveyor, was out there as well in the Ohio River Valley. And he was there when the French decided to try to block this move by the English to set up a bunch of forts, like Fort Duquesne at the juncture of the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers, where they become the Ohio River in what is now Pittsburgh.
Went ahead and built their forts, which pissed off the English, so they sent an up-and-coming British lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington with a combined force of British troops and Native Americans. After a short battle, the French commander said, all right, we surrender. Okay, boys, pack it up. They're surrendered.
Oh, sorry. It wasn't an overexcited Native American who started the French and Indian War. It was George Washington who ordered his troops to fire on the French.
Sorry, was I not meant to split his head open with a tomahawk? Don't worry, it's not like this will start a 7-year-long major global conflict. And what happened next was a 7-year-long major global conflict, which Great Britain won at the peace.
Okay, a 7-year-long international conflict. Actually, this is considered by some historians to have been the first actual world war. England did win. France lost their territory in North America that they had called New France. And here on the map, you're going to see the Spanish possessions finally, after they got the French territory of Louisiana, which the French had named after their Sun King, Louis XIV. Of course, Napoleon would take this back from the Spanish in 1800, and then almost immediately sell it off to the Americans.
Negotiations, Spain gave up Florida, while France gave up all of its territories in North America. But Britain's victory came at a cost, a £60 million cost. They were now broke, in a lot of debt, and had to come up with some way to repay it. So they went to the colonies and said, okay, listen up. So a huge part of the war was spent protecting you from the French, and now we have no money because of it. So I'm not sure what you're saying here. Okay, so we spent a lot of money protecting you from the French, right? Right, and now we're broke. That certainly is a pickle. Listen to me. We spent all of our money protecting you, and now we need money. Can you please pay us back some money? No. Okay, we're just going to go ahead and tax you. In 1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing the colonists to import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duty.
Okay, so the Sugar Act of 1764, there had actually already been a Molasses Act since 1733, but it hadn't been strictly enforced until Britain actually really needed the money. So that's why 1764 becomes important. The other really, really important thing that the British do at this point is they come out with what's called the Royal Proclamation that sets what's called a proclamation line along the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. And the king says, you British Americans are not allowed to cross it and settle in that territory that all of your land speculators were looking at, because this is going to be reserved for our allies, the Indians, who helped us win this French and Indian War. And of course, the British Americans are not having that. They believed that they had just fought and died in this war to secure this land.
Duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new shack. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains everything? Yes, please. Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay. No. Don't do it.
Don't do it.
Damn. Obviously, the colonists were like, hey, my dudes, this new tax legislation right here, this is BS. Until now, they had enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves, and now suddenly Britain was asserting its control. They were especially unhappy because they didn't have any representatives in the parliament that was levying taxes on them.
Okay, they did have representation in Parliament, but it wasn't direct representation. But when you think about it, if they had had a couple of direct representatives, would that have changed the outcome in any way? Would that have stopped the king's government from assessing them with taxes? I don't think so.
So they protested. Orators gave fiery speeches. British goods were boycotted, and anyone loyal to the British found themselves increasingly harassed. The whole thing actually began to take quite a toll on British business, and after just a couple years, the British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But we still desperately need money. What should we do? We could try taxing the colonies. Great idea. Wait, didn't we literally just try that and it failed miserably? Man, look at me. I look fabulous. Have you ever seen such a handsome boy? No siree, Georgie. No way. You're the handsomest, smartest, most popular king that ever lived, and everybody likes you. So
George III was possibly a little bit nuts at this time. Later on, he was seriously nuts, and in 1788, a regent was actually appointed to rule on his behalf.
You're doing such a good job. Your Majesty? Oh, you're still here.
Cat again.
Get the hell out. So in 1766, the British made a declaration saying, we can do what we want because we're in charge and you can all go suck it. Then they levied a whole bunch of new taxes on the Americans via import duties. Glass? There's a tax for that. Lead? There's a tax for that. Paper? Tea? Oil? There's a tax for that. And once again, the Americans boycotted British goods, British business felt the pinch, and the British had to back down. Alright, this is ridiculous. They're my colonies and I have to be able to assert my control. Repeal all the new taxes except for the one on tea. Also send 1,000 troops to Boston to take control. Oh, and make the colonists pay for them.
Okay, so this is called the Quartering Act. In addition to these 1,000 troops that the Crown is now sending over, the British had left 10,000 troops in the American colonies to protect against any re-invasion by the Indian allies of the French or by the French themselves, who might want to take back some of the territory that they had lost. So the idea was that the British Americans should kick in a little bit for their defense.
And as British troops arrived, the tension in Boston was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, and it was all about to come to a head. On March 5th, a band of local patriots began heckling a British guard at the customs house. More and more Americans joined in the heckling, while more British troops turned up in support of their comrade. Snowballs were thrown at the British. The snowballs turned to rocks, the rocks to oyster shells. The soldiers, outnumbered, panicked. One thing leads to another, and you can see where this is going. 5 civilians were killed.
Actually, most historians think that 3 civilians were killed. This is the famous engraving of the Boston Massacre that Paul Revere made a couple weeks later that became one of the biggest propaganda devices to enrage the colonists against these tyrannical British troops and the tyrannical British government that had sent them over.
Patriot press throughout the colonies declared the Boston Massacre an unwarranted crime committed against the people of Boston by the cruel British, and the anger continued to grow. A British revenue schooner that ran aground in Rhode Island was burned by the locals. When it came to light that the governor of Massachusetts supported the suppression of the colonists, his house was burned by the locals. And next, the colonists would set their sights on the remaining tax on tea. On December 16, 1773, a band of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, marched down to Boston Harbor, boarded a British merchant ship loaded with tea, and in front of thousands of spectators, threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard.
There were also groups called the Daughters of Liberty, who maybe weren't quite as aggressive. They organized spinning bees to spin yarn, to create cloth, to make homespun clothing for their family, and support the boycott on British textiles.
British were disgusted, and they punished Massachusetts with a vengeance. They dissolved its General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city, meaning Boston and Massachusetts were now essentially under the direct rule of Great Britain. And oh boy, were the people pissed. The other colonies saw what was happening and worried they might be next. So they called a brain trust to decide what to do. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered and met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, and the roll call read like a who's who of America's finest thinkers. I'm talking lawyers extraordinaire Johnny A and Johnny J, experienced military commander George Washington, businessman and future alcoholic beverage Samuel Adams, fiery orator Patty H, guy who married a rich lady Big J Dickinson, and while they
And that's the only mention of a lady, isn't it? This is a bunch of really, really elite white men from all over the colonies. But one thing that we should notice is that not all of the colonies. There are over 30 British colonies at this time. Some of them in the Caribbean, like Barbados and Jamaica. Some of them to the north in what became Canada. And not all of these places, of course, sent delegates to Philadelphia to this Continental Congress.
They weren't present at the first Congress. Soon names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and much later Alexander Hamilton would all serve time in the Continental Congress. The question now, though, was what to do about the British. After much bitter debate and disagreement, they eventually agreed on an amazing solution. They would simply ask the British to stop. Can you stop? No, it didn't work. Okay, then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan. So British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the rebels time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence.
The shot heard round the world is a phrase that comes from the Ralph Waldo Emerson poem, Conquered Hymn, which he wrote in 1837. So this isn't what they called it at the time. This is what people remembering it patriotically called it a couple generations later.
The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British lit up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more patriot rebels kept showing up, and this time it was the British who were outnumbered as more fighting kicked off in Concord. The most professional army in the world was forced to flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen.
Now, this idea that these were local, poorly trained militia is not really true. Colonies like Massachusetts required all able-bodied men from the ages of 16 to 60 to serve in the militia and to be called up whenever there was a conflict. And so many of these people who were adults, who were over 26 years or so, had probably fought in the previous conflict, the French and Indian War, only 10 years earlier. So these were people who were not only well-trained, but had seen action and also met at least on an annual basis on town commons to drill and to update their fighting skills. And of course, they were also always using their muskets and rifles to hunt game. So they were by no means amateurs.
And all along the British route back to Boston, patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British. When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city. And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who, as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. No.
Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are really, really interesting radicals. And they continue to be radicals throughout the American Revolution and even afterwards. Vermont isn't one of the original 13 and doesn't become the 14th state until 1791. And all that time, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys are active, resisting incursions from New York to their west and New Hampshire to their east. Both of whom wanted to take Vermont land and settle their people on it.
No, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. This went on for some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home, and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch. What the fuck? Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered their rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George. Dude. Uncool. So Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British.
Notice how Boston in this map is on a peninsula that's connected to the mainland by this narrow strip of land at the bottom. This has changed a whole lot since then.
British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back. The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400. The colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war, and they were ready for it. But one thing they weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George saying, "Hey man, looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends. I'm gonna kick your ass." Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure? Just do it. What does it say? He's gonna lick my... Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small engagements continued to occur around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During
the French and Spanish, who were the people who had gotten the short end of the stick in the last war with Britain. So that might have been an additional reason why they wanted to support the colonists who were making so much trouble for their adversary.
Time, there was also minor fighting going on between Patriot and Loyalist militias in the southern colonies.
Patriot and Loyalist militias in the southern colonies. That wasn't really minor fighting. At least a quarter of South Carolinians actively resisted the revolution. And many more, probably more than half of the total population, passively resisted by avoiding conscription or deserting, by not paying their taxes, and by refusing to sell supplies to the rebels. So in a lot of places, this was really kind of a civil war. And there were as many as 400,000 loyalists in America who didn't want to separate from Great Britain. Now, many of those people, when the revolution was accomplished, did give in and become American citizens. But 70,000 of them didn't. They left America and went either north to an area of Nova Scotia that got carved off and renamed New Brunswick, or down into the Caribbean, or into Florida, which was another place that didn't go along and join our revolution.
Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack. The Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeat...
Some smallpox on the side. After the Continental Congress sent 2 invitations to the Canadians to join the rebellion, but were ignored, Benedict Arnold goes ahead and invades Canada. Now, many historians believe that the British defenders sent smallpox-inoculated people who were infected with the smallpox virus out into the army that was besieging Quebec, killing up to 5,000 people. And if that's true, then this is one of the first instances of biological warfare in Western history.
Defeated and pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses
This guy is Henry Knox. He not only brought guns to Boston, he had been at the Boston Massacre, he had been at the Boston Tea Party, and he later became George Washington's Secretary of War when Washington was elected the first president. Fort Knox in Kentucky, where all the gold is kept, is named after this guy, who was also ridiculously fat by the time he died. He weighed over 300 pounds.
He uses oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental Army surrounding Boston. Boom. Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now, they could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the ideas of others. Instead, the Continentals worked through the night setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city, and when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate, and Washington had...
It wasn't really an unknown fate. They went to Nova Scotia and regrouped, and then they attacked New York City 5 months later.
His first victory of the war. Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written...
Thomas Paine was 38 at this time. He was not a friendly old man. He did live to an old age. He died at the age of 72, but that's not for decades yet.
and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire. Common Sense was a 47-page pamphlet that Thomas Paine wrote and then donated, gave to the Patriots to support the cause. It was the most popular pamphlet ever printed in America. And he could have been wealthy beyond his dreams, but he donated it to the cause. And then he went to France to help with the French Revolution later. So all in all, an interesting guy. Spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls, and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard, writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of... We don't have to talk about that. Jefferson's slaves. We've been saying we don't have to talk about that for over 150 years. Maybe it's time to talk about that. July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later, Independence Action came into effect. The United States of America was born. Actually, independence didn't really come into effect until the war was won. As I said, there were still over 400,000 loyalists in the colonies. And the British, as you're about to see, took New York and occupied it until 1783, which is almost 2 years after the fighting ended. So independence really isn't quite a done deal yet. There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, it was treason. And if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. The past tense of hang is hanged, not hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York.
That's
Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for an attack to come. But the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while building their own strength. At one point, they launched a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind, and when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. Now, this was actually thought of as a brilliant move on Washington's part. Nobody really expected him to do this, to move his troops by night and to cross the river like that. Don't know why people didn't expect it, but it was a surprise to them. But in general, this whole period, this Battle of Brooklyn Heights, is a real example of professional generalship on the part of the British and really kind of shoddy leadership on the part of the Americans. Washington had the additional problem that his troops weren't that well trained and oftentimes would cut and run when the fighting got hard. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. And actually, a few weeks after all of this, a quarter of the city of New York was burned, and in the aftermath, a 21-year-old former school teacher named Nathan Hale was blamed for it and executed for spying by the British. He had only one life to give for his country. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day. And will survive to react another day. But that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.